Welcome to Trash Compactor. I'm Josh. As many listeners know, we're fans of multiple storytelling universes, not just Star Wars, and today we're going to be discussing the connections between Star Wars and another long running fictional adventure series with sci fi fantasy flavor, Doctor Who. And joining me today to talk Doctor Who and Star Wars is returning guest, the engineer of the Game of Rassilon podcast, the best Doctor Who RPG podcast out there, Michael Nixon.
Hello, and welcome back to actually me. Oh, hold on. Anyway, moving on.
Moving on. um, And also joining us, first time guest, she's a comedian, writer, author of such books as Exploring Tatooine, an Illustrated Guide, and one time incarnation of the Doctor herself and current GM of the Game of Rassilon podcast. Please welcome Riley Silverman. How you doing, Riley?
Hello. Hi, how are you?
I'm very excited to talk to both of you because maybe it's more common than it used to be, but I don't know many crossover Star Wars Doctor Who fans who are as into it as the two of you are. Maybe that's more and more common these days. I don't know. What's your sense of the crossover in Star Wars Doctor Who
Well, there are going to be a
fandom? Just
lot more soon.
Yeah, I
I mean,
yeah.
we'll get to that later, but
I
it's going to
well,
be a
I was
lot
gonna
more
say, I think
crossover.
your thing is problem is there's not that many Doctor Who fans at least in the American. There are a lot of Doctor Who fans. Let me before I get, but like in the American sense, I feel like it had a brief jump in popularity in America at one point that kind of then tapered off again. And I think otherwise, your Doctor Who fans. I mean, before I get people mad at me, there are plenty of American Doctor Who fans, but it's always been kind of this niche, smaller fandom compared to other big. It's kind of like Warhammer versus D&D, right? Like there are people in America who play Warhammer, but I wouldn't say the Warhammer audience is to the level that the D&D audience is, and so on. Or like Babylon 5 versus Star Trek fans. Like I said, the fans are there and they are
sure.
mighty, but they're a very cloistered group, and there are crossovers, of course, but that might be why it feels that way too. I would say I think that most Doctor Who fans that I encounter are Star Wars fans as well, or at least are appreciative of Star Wars. I don't find very many Doctor Who fans who abjectly dislike Star Wars. Whereas, like, I think it's more that Star Wars fans. I mean, Star Wars is essentially one of the biggest brands of franchise titles in the world. So I think
Yes.
that like you're going to have a lot more Star Wars fans who have never ever seen of or barely heard of Doctor Who. Like they think of Doctor Who as the guy who fights
Right.
trash cans in a phone booth, So
Right. Right.
which is not inaccurate.
Right. No, it's not. No, that's certainly true. Um, I just want to discuss the literal connections between Star Wars and Doctor Who. I think there are some very clear ones,
They're
mainly
both
in
set in
terms of
space. Yeah.
both set in space sometimes, but
Well, it's
also,
always in space. I don't know if you know how space works, but literally everywhere is actually.
well, that's
Sorry,
true.
I'm being an asshole. I'm
Ooh,
sorry. I'll stop.
roasted.
No, no,
Oh,
no, no.
I'll let
You're
you do
being
your intro for your segment and stop roasting you.
no,
I'm sorry. I
no.
don't
You're
even know
being
you. I'm being
absolutely.
so mean to you.
I love it. I love it. I don't know what that
Michael's
says
like,
about
why did
me.
I invite this person on?
no, I'm like, get him, Riley. Yes. Just getting the popcorn ready. It's over here in the corner. It's having fun.
But yeah, like the thing that I think of when I think of like the Venn diagram, the crossover section of Doctor Who and Star Wars, I think of Julian Glover and Michael Sheard, the two actors who, made careers out of being villainous to Star Wars fans and Indiana Jones fans. But there are a lot of actors because Star Wars, the original trilogy in particular, was shot in the UK. And the coterie of actors in the UK is, I don't want to say smaller than the US in a derogatory
It's
way,
it's
but it's sort of
incestual. It's a lot of the same people get used for the same productions over and over again. Yeah.
right. So you see a lot of the same faces on British TV, and for an American production shooting in England, they just say, okay, like, who do you got that's like, 6 foot, and throw him in the Darth Vader suit. Hey, do you want to be Darth Vader or Chewbacca? I guess I'll be the baddie because it sounds like it's a more interesting part. It's sort of that
I'm not
stuff.
sure that's how the casting process went, but I do like that you imagine that's how it went.
No,
Like,
no, that actually is how it went.
Wait,
That
really?
actually is how it went. Yeah,
They just went, hey, you're tall. Which tall suit do you want to wear? Because
yeah.
that's amazing to me because that's the way people on the internet seem to think casting works nowadays for most shows. Like, I remember when they were talking about finding a replacement for an unnamed Star Wars character because unnamed actor was unceremoniously let go of the series of The
Oh,
Mandalorian,
yes.
and people were talking about replacements, and people were like, "Why don't you just cast someone and then ask them who they want to play?" I'm like, "'Cause that's not how casting works. Like, there's a script, and then you cast the people to play the characters in the script. You don't just go, "Hey, you look like you could be in space. Who do you want to be, kid?" Like,
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, just as a sidebar, one of the great frustrations of participating in Star Wars fandom and Doctor Who fandom is the
The
lack of
fans?
understanding
Sorry,
of
go.
how. Yes, well, yes, no, well,
The
So,
biggest
so
problem
but
with the
also
fandom is the
it,
fandom.
exactly.
fandom.
That is
Well,
literally how I feel.
it's not the biggest problem with fans online, but like,
I would say racism
there's
probably is the biggest problem with fandom. Racism and
probably.
sexism combined are the
Yes,
biggest.
I would agree with that. So, but one of the problems with fans online
One of the problems it is
franchise is
also a systemic problem with
yes,
society.
right. Yes, yes, yes. It's just a fundamental lack of understanding of how film and television is made. So
Mm.
you get into arguments about like, why something is a certain way or not a certain way and it's like, why didn't they just hire so and so to do this? Like, duh, that's it's like, well, like that's not how it works.
Wow.
It's like you don't
The
just
The way people whenever Doctor Who has new casting coming out, the way people talk about who they should have cast to play whatever characters, I'm like, you have no idea how these shows work or what budgets they have or where like you're not going to get these A-list actors to come and
mhm.
film a show that was funded on public money in the UK for like a 10-month shoot. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen.
no, totally. I mean, so I was going to discuss this at the end, but we might as well talk about it now. I think last week or the week before, a distribution deal was announced between BBC Worldwide and Disney Plus for the new seasons of Doctor Who for the specials next year and Series 14, the debut of the, I guess we're calling him the 15th Doctor now.
15. Yep.
Uh,
15th, yeah. Shurigawa.
um, yeah, which is weird that I didn't think that they were actually really going to commit that hard to the bit that David Tennant is now the 10th Doctor and the 14th Doctor. I
So,
thought that they were going
okay,
to pull a War Doctor thing and be like, yeah, but that's not the numbering.
I think the thing is that the couple thoughts on that are that first of all, like the numbering we give the Doctor is really just an arbitrary, like this is the actor who
Yes,
played it for this amount of time. I think that's why people get like thrown off and they're like, well, actually, they're like the 17th Doctor because you have to count the hand and you have to count the meta crisis and the time. I'm like, no, you don't, because it's not in story. It's just what we call
right,
it. So I think there between like what I would say, like, I don't know if I think the 14th Doctor is so much a bit as much as I think it's like Russell's trying to actively say, this is not just the 10th Doctor again. This is a new
right,
Doctor who has this
right.
phase. And we'll see if that ends up being the case once the episodes air. Because it's kind of hard when you also are going to be having Donna back. Like, is it going to be a like repeat of the same Doctor, or is he going to have different? I was really hoping that he was going to speak with his Scottish voice instead of
Mm.
his London accent as a way of making it. This is a different guy.
No, yeah, like that's exactly what I mean. Like I because the new Doctor Who magazine came out, I think a few days ago, with interviews with Russell T Davies and David Tennant and everybody. They are referring to David Tennant as the 14th Doctor, and it's sort of
Mm.
so when I say committing to the bit, like I realized in that moment, like oh, like this is not hey, I'm reverting to the 10th Doctor again for a couple of specials. It's this is a distinct incarnation, and they are really making sure that is clear.
Yeah. They're even having adventures with him already in the Doctor Who magazine as the 14th Doctor. It's gonna be wild in a few years when David Tennant starts doing Big Finish audios as the 14th Doctor versus the 10th Doctor.
Oh no, it's inevitable.
It's like this is really uncharted territory for the show and like how like yeah it's not the same doctor returning, it's another incarnation played by
Hmm.
the same actor.
Yeah.
And so like I mean, that's never really happened before, and what exactly the mechanics of that are going to be really interesting to divine, not only just from like an in-universe standpoint, but also I have to believe thematically the only thing that I keep returning to in my mind is like, I mean, sure. I mean, first of all, it's the 60th anniversary year, but it's also like we have to engage with the past and indulge the nostalgia hard to say why we have to move forward, right?
Yeah.
Like, given who the writer is and like what his inclinations are, and I think his view of the show, is that I think RTD said shortly after it was announced that he was returning as showrunner was that like for him, Doctor Who always has to be new,
Yeah.
right? So from the mouth of the man who just said that to then recast an old face, right?
Yeah.
Like it has to be for a reason that is in
Agreed.
line with his stated view and plan for the show. So
Yeah.
that's
And I
the
think
only thing that makes sense in my head.
Yeah, and I think even, like, to the degree of he's even doing something different for an anniversary than they normally would do for an anniversary. It does seem like Doctor Who's, like, go-to trick for anniversary specials. And I apologize to all your Star Wars listeners who don't know what we're talking about and haven't for about 10 minutes. But for all the anniversary specials, typically you've had your, your 3 doctors, you've had your 5 doctors, you've had your, your Day of the Doctor. And so that's like 3 different specials right there that have been multi-doctor stories, not even including the 2 doctors during the, a 6 doctors era. And then that's been like the move. It's like we're just going to take a couple of doctors and throw them together and make them be the doctor together and have fun with it. And so this is like the first time I think where for like a milestone anniversary for the special, they're going, you know what? Let's do something a little bit different this time. Let's do maybe it's unusual. Like, we'll see how it actually plays out. Who knows? We may end up getting a secret multi-doctor story and we don't know it. But if until we know that information, like I think it's really like it is a unique thing to do as being like, what if we have a old face on a new doctor and give him an adventure? And obviously we're gonna have him check in with an old companion of his. But I also do think it's interesting because I'm wondering because I know the Disney Plus deal didn't come in until this summer, and Russell was brought back a while ago. So I'm like, how much of this planning for these 3 specials was done with the idea that we were going to be then having Disney Plus come in? So, or are these 3 specials kind of the swan song for the 2005 reboot era of relaunch era of Doctor Who, and then starting with Shooty moving forward, is that kind of this new era of the show where now they have these Disney Plus budgets because they were filming the 60th before the Disney Plus deal happened. So I don't know if we're going to
Yeah.
see these like triple budgets during those episodes versus what we're going to be seeing once 15's era takes over. So I'm really fascinated by this future.
Right. Well, to speak to what you just said, there was a production diary for the specials in the new issue of Doctor Who magazine, and they showed the cuts of the 3 specials to the BBC and to Disney Plus for notes. So they're already written and well into production, if not completed, by the time this all transpired. So I do believe series 14 or series like 41 or season 1 or
The
whatever
next-
they're going
I
to
think
call
he's
it.
calling it season. I think he's calling it season 1 or series 1. Like I think it's like that level of like
No.
I wrote last
Not
spring.
again. No.
I wrote it's Marvel Comics. I wrote last spring for Nerdist an article
Mhm.
about the eras of Doctor Who and how I really think that the Disney Plus thing changes it a little bit, but or at least maybe changes what it's going to be called. I'm guessing now it's going to be called the Disney Plus era, but or the Disney era or whatever. But when I wrote about it, I wrote about how there are, in my opinion, 3 very strong epochs of Doctor Who. And that is you have the classic series from, 63 to 89. And then are those years right, Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, it
Yes.
was. Okay, 63, 89. Then I think you have the wilderness years, which is
Mhm.
that era in between 89 2005, where you've got your Paul McGann movie, you've got the new Target New Adventure novels, you got like the beginnings of Big Finish and stuff like that. So you have people scrambling to make Doctor Who in a world where there is no Doctor Who, essentially. And then you finally have 2005, and you have this relaunch, which people have called the Modern Who. But Modern Who has now been around for 17 years. I mean, it's going to be 18 when the 60th special aired. It's getting close to the amount of time that the classic series ran for before it ended. And it was kind of getting long in the tooth as a like revival series as well. So I think it needed a new shakeup. And so when it was announced that Bad Wolf was taking over production from the BBC, it very much felt like, okay, we now have a situation where the show is probably going to be very different moving forward. And this might actually be a new era for the show. And then I think that the Disney deal really, for me, like nailed that to the wall. Like this is a different time period now.
No, no, I think you're totally right, which is sort of in line with, when RTD says, so by the way, the name for the upcoming era that I am partial to myself is RTD 2.
That's
It fits
possible.
your podcast for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Well, reason why I'm not calling it that, I've seen people do that, and I like that as a name. The reason why I'm not calling it that is because he's not going to stay forever. He's probably going to stay for like a few years and then hand it off. And I want to have a name that encompasses his era moving forward.
No, 100%. Like, also, one of the problems that the new show, the modern show, has had is there's no obvious successor to the showrunner position. Like,
Yeah.
Russell T Davies got really lucky that he happened to have someone like Stephen Moffat, who was very clearly that like mixture of really good TV writer, which is like a skill in and of itself, and also really knows Doctor Who, and also has, I don't want to say irreverence, because it's not like the thing about what you have to do to have a vision for what Doctor Who should be is that you can't be precious about it. It's like, you need to understand it and respect it, but you also need to have the willingness to make it do new things that it has never done before, because otherwise it just stays the same
Yeah.
and it gets long in the tooth.
That's a good segue into Star Wars a little bit. But I would say all I last thought on that is that, like, I agree with you on that with Stephen Moffat, and I will do my best not to badmouth Chris Chibnall too much. But one thing I've really learned from this most recent era, and even towards the end of Moffat's era, even though I Moffat's era had a lot of high highs and a lot of low lows, and it's his low lows are worth criticizing, and people have a lot of things that are valid to say about them. I ultimately like them a lot. I think they're my favorite years of the modern relaunch era. But at the same time, I think the flaw with I think what you're saying is right, but I also think that we need to stop doing that group anymore because a lot of the people who have had the mantle of the show since 2005 are the people who were running the stuff during the wilderness years and basically like, well, if I ever got my shot at the show, this is what I would do with it. And
Right.
now they've done it. And like I'm sure there are other talented writers from that like stable of people who would have done a great job as showrunner of Doctor Who. But at the same time, I feel like we're starting to see a lot of retreading of the same ideas just from different writers because they're all kind of coming out of that space. And I think the show having been back since 2005 and having had a lot of writers who have come through, I hear what you're saying about there not being an apparent heir to the role, but I don't know if I agree that it's true because I think that there are writers who have been great
Mm,
over the course of the run that I think would be good and have like grown up with Doctor Who and in ways that similarly we're seeing with like Star Wars now. We're seeing a lot like
Mm,
I think there are Ryan Johnsons out there for Doctor Who. There are people who are like,
mhm,
yes, I grew up with this, I loved it, but I also grew up in a different sensibility of writing and probably do something very different with it and unique. And I think that we're seeing now with Last Jedi, which is, at this point 5 years ago, but also we're seeing with Andor, like we're seeing people who are creating stories set and then like also all the writers who have done High Republic stuff. And hopefully, with Leslie Headland coming up with the Acolyte. Because
the Acolyte.
even I think Dave Filoni is the Star Wars version of a Stephen Moffat. I think he's the guy that like has
Interesting,
such
yeah.
reverence
oh
for oh, I just made Michael hit the couch with that comment. But he's the guy you said
no,
who
I
has
have. Oh, sorry. If you put a quarter in me about Filoni, I won't stop. I'm personally not a fan, and I have a.
I wanna hear. Well
Okay,
well
sorry, Riley. Please
well,
finish
so
your
no,
thought. I have a
long story short, I'm saying he's the guy who I think is that exact mix between reverence for George Lucas, but also like very, very strong ideas about what he would do with it and what he wants to do with it, and like
yeah.
manages to
mhm,
speak those well. But at the same time, I'm really fascinated by the Star Wars shows that are being done by other people because I do think these other voices coming into it are bringing a lot to it. I think Star Wars has an advantage over Doctor Who in that there are so many clearly defined eras of storytelling in Star Wars that you can actually do different types of stories just by changing where you're setting your piece at. Like Andor
Mm,
fits perfectly where it is in the Age of Empire. If you try to do the exact kind of Andor storytelling during like a Republic era, it might feel very different. It wouldn't be necessarily worse or better, but it'll be a very different feeling of a show. And similar with like First Order stuff. And yeah.
no, for sure, for sure. The other thing too that you reminded me of, like, I think one of the things Russell is absolutely going to be doing, I'm sure, is developing new talent, finding the heir apparent to hand it over. Like, I don't think he wants to be the showrunner for Doctor Who for another 5 or 6 or 7 years. Like,
I don't either.
I think he wants to set it off like he has this new vision, this like relaunch, retooling of the show for a new media landscape, like the same way that he did in 2005. And I think he wants to set everything up and then hand the keys over to somebody, younger, frankly,
I think
who
it's even darker than that. I think he thought the show was not going to survive past the era that just ended, and I think he felt
yeah.
like he had to help save it. Like I think if the Bad Wolf deal hadn't happened and Russell hadn't come back to showrun and David Tennant wasn't coming back to be the new Doctor for a brief amount of time, we would have seen the show end with Jodie Whittaker. I think that
I think
she
you're
would have
right
been the last Doctor, and I'm glad that for lots of reasons I'm glad that didn't
for
happen because
lots
I'm
of
sure they would
reasons.
have blamed her for it. But
Mhm.
yeah,
Right.
I think you're right. I think Russell is in a position of I am here to save this show, I'm here to
and ensure
kind
that
of
it has a
re
future.
yeah, re-rudder it
Yeah.
and then find a new generation to tell stories with it. Because I think there was I haven't read the Doctor Who magazine stuff completely, but I've seen excerpts from it. And I heard them
Yeah.
mention of people working on the show who were teenagers when the show came back in 2005. And there are people who I think who have written for the show in the last generation of writers or so that I think would be really interesting voices to see take over the show.
Several from the Chibnall era, as a matter of fact, and also the last couple of years of
Mhm.
Stephen Moffat.
Sarah Dollard, somebody, for example. Yeah, Vinny Patel,
right.
someone
Exactly.
I'd be interested
Mhm.
to
Yes.
see what Vinny
No,
Patel could do with
absolutely.
it.
Jamie
Yeah.
Matheson as well as Dollar. I think Series 9
Jamie,
was a
yeah.
real Series 9 always felt to me like an audition series for new showrunners.
Yeah.
And then like Peter Harness pitched that Monk story and it was like, put him in the fucking trash can. Anyway,
Wait, before I move on to
so
themes, I do want to come back to Michael real quick. I'm not
I
hosting, but
have I
what I'm
have
saying is,
notes on like all the stuff I want to circle back on, but
well, what I
please.
want to say is before we move on to completely from connections between Star Wars and Doctor Who, I want to let you name your favorite connection of actor from Star Wars and Doctor Who.
Oh, well, it's Simon Pegg, but
Oh, wait.
also Peter Cushing.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's Peter Cushing, but I
Oh
I
God,
think it'd
how
be
did I
remiss
not?
if we didn't mention. Well,
How
your
did that
head's in the
not?
classic trilogy. I understand completely, but Simon Pegg being a modern example of that is, I think,
Yeah.
really wanted to make sure we noted that because I feel like people listening are going to be shouting at the podcast a few minutes ago, and I just wanted to make sure we're like, we hear you.
Yeah. Or even Shona from Last Christmas, who is Vel on
Yes,
Andor
yes, she's
currently.
I
And I
love
love her
that
on both
actress.
things.
Oh my god, she's in I think she's in the new Lady Chatterley's Lover, and she's fantastic
She
in
was
that
the
movie.
waif on Game of Thrones.
I
She's so
never
good.
put that together. No, yeah, no, you're
Oh,
absolutely right. She was in Last Christmas.
I'm weirdly fixated on Shona. I love Last Christmas. It's one of my favorite Christmas specials. And
No, it's
so,
incredible. I love Last
yeah.
Christmas.
And
Mhm.
I have a running gag about it because in the end, when she wakes up and she has like her list of things to do, one of them is forgive Dave. And I've always joked, like, we never got to the conclusion of the forgive Dave story. What did Dave do to Shona? And also, I think from what I
It's a
understand,
big
Dave
finish. It's a
Art.
big finish
Yeah, big
spin-off series
finish.
that'll run for 12 years.
Dave, the
and
guy
I
who
was
annoyed Shona. Like it's gonna
last
be
year
their
at
worlds of
Galley,
Doctor Who. Yeah.
when I was on the Cornell Collective, we were told to pitch what we would pitch as a Big Finish spinoff series. And I pitched Dave, and I was
No,
like,
you
"What
didn't.
happened to Dave? Should
Rules.
she forgive him? What's he doing? What was Dave doing during a time war? When's our War Dave series?"
The War Dave. Oh my
Yes.
god, what was he up to?
Yeah,
Ah.
but
And
she's
then you gotta
incredible
have
on
River
Andor. She's a
Song bump
very good
into Dave. Yeah.
actress. We now
Eh,
know, who she's related to, and I don't know how spoilery we can or can't be, so I should be careful. But has Andy Serkis done a Doctor Who?
I was thinking about that. Andy Serkis would be amazing in any Doctor Who part, but I think he's
he
too
would.
big for it now.
Yeah, I was wondering if
You
he
know?
had done it like as like a voice or something at some point.
But at some point, if Andrew Garfield does a Star War, that's one more we can check off.
Yes,
That's
then
true.
right.
Which
So
is
so
possible.
Hugh Quarshie is one. He played Captain Panaka in The Phantom Menace, and then he was in The
Oh,
Evolution of the Daleks.
cool. So we got one from all the wars eras. That's awesome. That's
We
neat.
almost had Matt Smith, and it ended up not happening. But
I think he was supposed to be like a clone of Palpatine or
yeah,
something,
before they
or he
decided to just have Ian McDiarmid play Palpatine, they were gonna have
Yeah.
him
right.
be like a younger version of him.
He had a weird run of like playing big bads, or maybe playing because he was like
Yeah,
Skynet in that one term. Anyway,
he's currently playing kind of a big bad on Game of Thrones House of the Dragon
also
right
true. Yeah, he was the villain in Morbius, as everybody remembers.
now.
No, just me. No,
I'm
okay.
pretty sure the Morbius
Well,
was the villain in Morbius.
that whole movie was the villain of that whole
Yeah.
movie.
No, that's what I meant.
Oh my
Morbius, the
Anyway,
goodness.
film, is the villain of Morbius.
yeah, yeah.
My favorite actor crossovers is John Hollis, who was Lobot in The Empire Strikes Back, and he was a character in The Mutants, the John Pertwee serial. Because during the pandemic, I started a full classic series rewatch,
Nice.
and I wanted to do it the way that. So Elizabeth Sandifer, the writer of TARDIS Eruditorum, she made the case a number of years ago that really made a lot of sense to me, that the classic series is not meant to be watched as these like feature length omnibus
Oh,
editions
not at
of
all. It's bad to
like
do it
single
similar.
stories.
Yeah.
So I had never really watched the show the way that it was actually designed to be watched, like one segment a week, or like one segment with some time in between. It's not all meant to be watched. So I decided to do that. Most Doctor Who stories I experienced as like a single feature length story, either on VHS or on DVD. And like it really was a revelation for me. Like all of a sudden, a lot of pacing things just sort of made sense. I was like, oh well, that's why this is like this. Is because I actually do not remember where we left off last week. So I'm glad that there's sort of this like 2 or 3 minute reprise of the end of last
Wow.
week. So I'm like, oh, right, right, right.
And
Like, so
you wouldn't have had it available on demand to go back and watch last week. So if you've missed last week's, you need to know what's happening. You wouldn't have it on tape. You wouldn't have it on rerun. So if you saw it, you saw it. If you didn't see it, I hope this show makes a good job of making me understand what happened. So
right, exactly, exactly. Like that's another thing. The only thing that I'm not really doing is I've been able to watch a lot of them on Blu-ray on like, a 60-inch TV. And like these shows were never meant to be rendered in that like high fidelity, right? So it's
yeah.
like
Oh
the
yeah.
effectiveness of
Oh,
like what you can get away with in terms of the old joke about shaky sets and cardboard walls and bubble wrap and everything. It's like, yes, except also, keep in mind they were experienced by most people in like grainy, staticky, black and white 13 inches. Like, so
Yeah.
it's like, it's a lot more forgiving. Anyway,
And even like modern shows or modern-ish shows are struggling with that too. Like a lot of shows that are getting remastered and
oh
re-released.
God.
oh,
There's a
totally.
whole thing on TikTok where people are finding Buffy episodes where you can like clearly see the stunt double.
Oh,
And I'm like,
that
yeah, because it's in
remaster is.
4K. Like it's in high
Uh,
def 4K. It wasn't
well,
as
no, that
obvious when it was airing.
that remaster was brutal. They took the 4:3 mats off, and they didn't like so that they didn't compensate, right? So there's just that remaster is particularly terrible, the Buffy one.
Yeah.
Whereas like The Wire, I have a friend who worked on The Wire remaster to move that back to or to change that to 16:9, and they like went in and painted out set stuff that was in the corners of the mat and things like that.
Oh, well, that's what's so interesting about the Harmy's despecialized Star Wars is that
Mm,
it actually restored like, people always think of Harmy's as just being like, "Oh, they took out all the special edition stuff." But, like, no, he actually went in and, made true like, 'cause the special edition is based off of, did like, the ones that are on Disney Plus right now, a lot of the colors are crushed, a lot of the stuff is not as, vivid as it could be, and Harmy actually went in and found, old prints that, that he, restored. So as much as it's called despecialized, it's actually like a pretty great quality print of the original. And like it would be great if Star Wars would actually go back and do a real official release of the original that fixed a lot of those things.
it's money on the table. They're just leaving it. It's a big pile of money sitting on a table. I still don't get it.
I mean, I think they're respecting the wishes of George Lucas. I mean, for right
Probably.
Oh,
now,
so we just gotta wait him out? That's brutal. All
I
right, whatever.
I'm
Well,
Cut
almost
yeah,
that
and that's a
out.
good
I'm
example.
almost certain.
He released that original trilogy on DVD at one point, and it's a terrible transfer. It's like watching a VHS tape that somebody recorded and saved onto a disc. It's
Mm,
brutal.
Yeah, well, so we actually next week I have an episode where I interviewed a guy who wrote 3 volumes on the history of Star Wars on home video that he goes through all of the transfers, which is a very fascinating discussion. And a bunch of episodes ago, I did an interview with one of the guys from Team Negative One, which created those 4K scans of film prints of the original Star Wars trilogy, like the 4K
mm,
77 sort of floating out there. And it's really interesting because if you watch one of the original trilogy movies like on Disney Plus or one of the Blu-ray releases, it's really scrubbed very clean. Like it doesn't really look like it was shot on film because, for modern audiences that is not acceptable. It makes it look like it
Like
was
it's
shot a
dirty
long
or
time
whatever.
ago, which it was.
Yeah. Mhm.
But one of the things that I really appreciate about watching those restorations is like you have the film grain and like some of the scratches like that were there on the negative. Like that's how this film was made and how it always existed.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a whole long way of saying that I got up to John Pertwee in my rewatch and I was watching The Mutants and there was this guy. I was like, he looks really familiar. He has a really familiarly shiny head. And I was like, who is that guy? And then I went on IMDb and I'm like, he's Lobot. He's Lobot from The Empire Strikes Back. That's incredible. So yeah, so that's probably my favorite crossover. Either that or Brian Blessed.
oh,
Uh,
dive. That's Flash Gordon, but still,
I know, wrong franchise.
come on.
But I
Um,
mean, that speaks to what you were saying earlier about the nature of this pool of British actors. Of if you're filming a sci-fi thing in the UK, you've got 20 guys you have to call, and that's how you
mhm.
do it. And especially with Star Wars, because you're actively trying to create a group in your story that seem imperialistic and domineering, and the way to do that is to put them in fascist uniforms and give them British accents.
Tom Baker, I believe, voiced the
The Bendu.
yes, the Bendu in
Mhm.
the Clone
Yeah,
Wars, right?
Yeah. Oh,
which
and
was a
David
big one.
Tennant. David Tennant voiced, he's a droid in the Clone Wars. I always forget what droid number he is, but he's the droid
Hmm.
who serves during the children the Padawans looking for their kyber crystals. He's the droid who helps them build their lightsabers for the first time.
There was something that
Very
I heard.
strange.
There's very famously an astronaut costume from the 10th
Yes.
Planet serial that somehow made its way on a bounty hunter in The Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah,
And then I've
Dengar. I think Dengar's got the Ambassadors of Death spacesuit. Yeah.
oh, I think you're right.
I
Yeah,
think that's what it is. Because there were a bunch of those, like, I think Dalek 6388 or one of those other sites that tracks down props like that. They tracked down, like, it was part of some batch of like spacesuits, and then they
right.
all like got rented out to various places. It's like that the two red tubes in Star
Yes,
Trek. The
that
two
show
red
up like
tubes
in
that
all
are in
sci-fi.
every
Yeah,
Star Trek, because
right.
it's a rented prop. They just had like a standing deal with a prop warehouse for that thing. The most recent one that I think popped on the internet was the gun in the Mandalorian's gun cabinet that is like maybe literally the stock from one of the machine gun Daleks from that Exelon serial, where like
What?
if you look at the I'm amazed you don't know this
I had no
but
idea.
there's in the first episode of the Mandalorian season 1, like the pilot, I guess, he opens up
Yeah,
that cabinet of guns, and one of the center guns has this like kind of strange flange on the end, and it's either a recreation, intentionally or no, or literally that gun. But that stock is taken off of when the Daleks got their machine gun arms from that one Dalek serial where their guns didn't work. So there may literally be a classic
Death to
Doctor
the
Who prop
Daleks, I think.
in.
That's
Yes, man, I don't know,
yeah.
but
That's
it's
that's crazy.
either way, like somebody, both versions of the story are cool. Like either it's the original prop like resurfaced, or somebody unwittingly made a perfect recreation of a Dalek gun arm, like just to put in a cabinet. Like both versions of the story are very fun.
Is there a possibility
Um,
that it's an Easter egg, like somebody did it on
oh,
purpose? Like, I want to have a Dalek in here.
I don't know. I because it's it's a gun that was used in another Star Wars scene, and the understanding is like, oh, they just like stuck the barrel on
Ah, gotcha.
a gun handle, right? Like, so I don't know all the details, but there's literally like a Dalek part. Well, not anymore because the ship has been atomized, but there was a Dalek part in the Mandalorian's ship.
That's very
Uh,
cool. I had no idea about that, but now I'm going to have to go back and look for that because that's very cool. Michael, I do want to hear your thoughts on Dave Filoni because the mention of his name seemed to elicit a strong reaction from you.
I don't get the like fan like laurels that are always thrown at that guy for like being super creative or whatever. Because I feel like anytime this is similar to your point right earlier of like Moffat having a default state of writing, which is like he always wants to write a sitcom. Like whatever he's doing, he just wants to be writing a sitcom, which is why like all of his shows turn into sitcom banter. He just wants to be doing that, right? But Dave Filoni, I think very similarly, they're like, hey, Dave, we have this like new concept. We'd like you to come up with the, could you come up with like the series idea? And it's like, all right, great. And he goes into his office
Am I to
and he
Space
takes off
Western?
his cowboy hat. Yeah, he takes off his cowboy hat and he removes the dog-eared copy of Lone Wolf and Cub, Volume 1, from the top of his head, and he goes, oh, there's going to be an old warrior, and they will get a cub. And he has done this for every fucking one of his shows. And everybody's like, Dave Filoni, genius, mastermind, incredible. The Mandalorian, Lone Wolf and Cub. The Bad Batch, 5 lone wolves and a cub. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Lone Wolf and Cub.
Go ahead and look at the
Uh,
credits for Obi-Wan Kenobi. Filoni did not do
okay, not that
Obi-Wan.
one.
In
Fine,
fact,
whatever.
Obi-Wan, even though it is Lone Wolf and Cubby, they part of why they delayed it was because it was more so originally. And when they first got the script, they're like,
Jesus.
this just feels like The Mandalorian. We need to make it a little bit different.
Dave was like, I bet Filoni was like, this is edging into my territory. We got to fix this up. Yeah, there was another one I had, but I can't remember it anymore. But like every time Dave Filoni makes a show, he just makes Lone Wolf and Cub again, and it is frustrating to me. Where it's like I would love for
Yeah,
newer writers with broader ideas than it's Lone Wolf and Cub again to write the Star Wars.
How much
So yeah,
of Mandalorian though do you think was Filoni doing that, and how much was Jon Favreau doing that? Because I felt like that Mandalorian to me felt more like Jon Favreau's
Favreau's
baby,
baby.
with Dave
I
sticking his stuff into it.
My whole quote unquote Filoni hypothesis is one, a joke. I need to be really clear. But two, it's responding to the people who praise Filoni like blindly. Like I totally agree with you that a lot of what The Mandalorian is, it's all Favreau. I think especially now it feels really Favreau-y.
Yeah.
And the Boba Fett was just like, oh, I can, if you didn't tell me Robert Rodriguez made that show, I would have guessed.
Yeah.
Like all that show needed was like a, a space mariachi. Like that was the only thing it was missing. Like that's it. Like,
I mean,
so
it does have Danny Trejo in it. So, I mean, like,
Yeah.
it's cutting close.
well, that's Space Machete,
That's
different guy,
true.
but still, yeah, yeah.
That's true. I meant like the
That's
tie. It's literally a
right,
through line.
but
Yeah.
it's a different Rodriguez universe, like
That's
the
true.
Desperado verse versus the Spy Kids universe, of which Machete is a part. We must remember.
Thank you for
That
bringing that.
is one cohesive universe. We have to always keep that in mind.
And I think, like,
Yeah.
that's what's interesting about this current era of Star Wars is that we are getting these different, like, visual styles and different storytelling styles that really fit which I think is what Star Wars has needed for a long time, is
Mhm.
having
Mhm.
stories that are from a point of view. Whereas I think, like, the flaw of I think, I think Solo was unfairly maligned. I think Solo ended up being a much better movie than it had any right to be, given how belabored and struggling that production was. But I do think, like, one of the big things was that they let Lord and Miller go, and by they, I mean Kathleen Kennedy, who I don't think it deserves as much demonization as she gets, but she does deserve some
No,
criticism. But I think that, like,
she's a businesswoman. Like she's making
yeah.
business choices.
And I
Like she's
think
not.
that, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that, like, what's nice about the Disney Plus series is I do feel like there's a little bit more freedom to let filmmakers tell their story and use Star Wars as a brush
Mhm.
versus those Star Wars story movies where it did feel like, okay, we're going to start with that and then we're going to homogenize it down into our one single, like, tone, and which is a lot of what Marvel does. Like, Marvel
Mhm.
does really
Right.
well when they can find a filmmaker who can work within what Marvel does, but if you cannot work within what Marvel does, you get the Eternals. So I think that, like, I think that that's what's really interesting about Andor is Andor somehow feels extremely Tony Gilroy, but also very Star Wars in a way that,
Very Star Wars.
like, it doesn't feel like any other Star Wars stories we've seen so far, except for, Rogue One to a degree. Rogue One felt much more studio noted than this
Well, yeah, I
did, and
mean,
he wasn't, but this this does feel a lot more like we're letting this person tell a story, and that's why I'm kind of excited for all these, like, upcoming shows that are outside of what we've already experienced. I'm less excited about ones that just feel like, "Hey, here are, like, aside seasons to Mandalorian." Like, I want the ones that are like, "Here's a different era,
mhm.
here's a different type of storytelling."
I don't need to see a lightsaber ever again in my life. Like I don't. I'm
Well,
good.
then
Thank you.
Well,
I
it's
mean,
been fun
I mean,
talking.
like
It's been
no,
good knowing you, being your
hey,
friend.
well, hey, no, hey, I love Andor. No, the thing I was gonna say that I do enjoy about the new Disney Plus era that I hope is also something that hopefully comes with like Doctor Who spinoffs. But the thing Andor is channeling like a go to real places and shoot Star Wars vibe.
love it.
Like they're
Yeah.
Yeah.
channeling this like whole other vibe of Star Wars that hasn't really been done since like digital tech really started.
Yeah.
There's the maligning of the prequel era for being all shot on a green screen, but George wanted to control, like Lucas wanted to control everything, right? Now I think there are creators, particularly in the sort of Andor zone, who are like, we need to embrace the chaos of like, we just need to find a place. And there's a great tweet about this somewhere, and I'm absolutely cribbing it, but it was like, we just need to find like a brutalist building and shove some sci-fi crates in it. Like that's good Star Warsing too.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that goes all the way back to something we started the episode here talking about, which is like, I don't think fans understand that there are whole departments whose job it is to like save money. Like
Right.
they're the
Yeah.
people whose entire job is to be like, no, we're not spending extra on that.
Yeah, and there's an article with Tony Gilroy recently about Andor, where he said
Mhm.
the only notes he's ever gotten that are, like, real notes from Disney have been budget. Like, everything
Yeah.
he's had to make a change for Andor has because they can't afford what they wanted to do, and they've had to find a way to write around it to make it less expensive, and that's, like, a really interesting thing about that show is that, like, you can do lots of creative things as long as you can keep it in budget. Like, that's the thing that I think a lot of it's unfortunate that the modern trend towards filmmaking is let's make the most expensive things we can possibly make, when instead it should be
Mm.
like, let's find a way to tell really interesting stories and use a budget to make us like limit ourselves. Like a great example he talked about in this article for, I think it was for the Hollywood Reporter. It wasn't the Rolling Stone article because I haven't read that one yet. But he was talking about the Aldani heist episode and how
Mhm.
when the Aldani people show up to celebrate the Eye, it was originally supposed to be like 3,000 or like 10,000 people. And then because of COVID, they were like, we cannot possibly film this. Like, we can't get that many people. We can't put them all in buses. And I guess they didn't want to do the CGI Lord of the Rings thing and like CGI in a crowd of people. So it ends up becoming like a few dozen at the most. And he said, like, weirdly, that budget limitation and that logistic limitation made the scene more powerful because now it felt like the remnants of a civilization that the empire had snuffed out completely, as opposed to just like them renting this space on this land from a pretty prosperous planet. And I think that like that kind of thing is really interesting to me. And yeah, with Andor, the location shooting is really fascinating because so much of what's happening in Star Wars TV making nowadays is volumes, right? Like so much of
Mm.
it is filming things on LED volumes. And like I think volumes are a great thing to have when you want to be filming on alien worlds that do not look like anything you can see on Earth. Like if you're looking for weird plants and you're looking for like the ocean as far as the eye can see and you don't have the money to do a water tank or whatever, that's something interesting. But I think when you're talking about the visceral feeling of being in an oppressive, brutal prison, or you're being in a, an ISB office building, like that, if you can't do that, you're like I said, like using a brutal building, set
Mhm.
decorating it and stuff like that. And that'll be interesting to see what happens with Doctor Who getting bigger budgets. Like, will it just be even fancier, the same hallway dressed up 3 times, or will it be, are they gonna film Doctor Who in volumes? Are they gonna film Doctor Who, like, are they gonna use a volume to recreate a quarry? Like, that's the running the Doctor Who thing of, like, we film this entire
Right.
episode in a quarry.
We
It's
could
gonna
bring
be
the
really
quarry to the
interesting.
yeah. I'm so skeptical of volumes because I feel like they're great for every person in the production except for the actor, which is like the one person you really need to be immersed in a scene.
Yeah.
Like it feels like they're still having to act to a tennis ball, except it's like a piece of paper
Well,
instead.
that's a good
Like
point
that's
too,
my
because I think that
concern.
was the problem with green screen acting for a long time. I think the volume's
Yeah.
a little bit of a step above green screen acting because you can actually see the environment around you. But yeah, I do think, like, when you watch those earliest movies that were being shot all in green screen, like Sky Captain and even, like, some of the prequel
Oh,
scenes,
I mean,
the actors don't know what to
yeah.
do, and I think, like, you
Mhm.
almost have to, like, relearn how to act in this new environment, and I think for volumes, we're getting into that as now as well. I think, unfortunately, we're also the shows and movies most likely to be filmed in a volume are the shows and movies that, like, they don't really care that much how good the acting is, so they're gonna keep moving on anyway, even if the take isn't the best take.
Well, I mean, it is super interesting to me because I think the volume, as with any technique or technology, is when it's utilized really well, then it's great. But when you use it as like a crutch or as a catch-all, then you start to see the limitations of it. Like I really enjoyed, had a great time with Obi-Wan Kenobi, and I don't have any like there's like nothing in it that I would consider huge problem or like a flaw, but there was a sense for me watching it, there were a lot of sort of interior spaces that seemed to like have the same dimensions weirdly as the
Yeah.
volume stage, right? And there were also some things like one thing that I heard one of the cinematographers on The Mandalorian say is that the thing that's key with the volume is luminance. So, for example, like when they want to shoot something like outside on the deserts of Tatooine in the middle of the day, they shoot that on the backlot in front of a green screen because they can't get the brightness bright enough from the volumes. So, with that in my head, I started seeing like all of these little things that just like knowing that it's an LED stage, I start to see it.
Mhm.
Yeah. A thing that I notice with volumes is the opposite when it's nighttime. Like, you almost can see the wall around, it almost feels like you're sitting on a set where you can see where the walls are and the seams because, like, there's a scene in Obi-Wan especially, I think it's in the last episode, where he's, like, in the desert with Reva, and I think it was shot in a volume at night, and it feels like he's on a set. Like, it feels so artificial.
That scene is exactly what popped into my head as soon as you said that. It's like that whole thing at night on Tatooine in the desert, like it just felt fake. It just felt like they were on a soundstage. It just really
Yeah.
did. The
Which is so
the
wild because it's a setting that you can film so easily not far from where they filmed that entire show. Like, it feels like you could have easily driven out to Death Valley and film, or gone down to, like, the Imperial Dunes where they filmed Return of the Jedi, and, like, it wouldn't have been that hard of a day to shoot, but they must just been
Yeah,
like,
well, I mean,
maybe because they were shooting it delayed so much, they had so little budget left, like, "We gotta shoot this here, it's what we got, we're doing it."
yeah, I mean, look, like this speaks to what we were saying earlier about how there's this broad lack of understanding of how films are made. You made a decision because you thought something was going to work one way, and then you see how it works, and maybe if it's not exactly how you thought it would go, like that's what you got, and you
Yeah.
can't reshoot it. Like it's not a movie. It's not unlimited money. It's timelines and budgets that you have to stick to. So like, maybe you realized the week before this isn't going to look that great. We should shoot this in the desert, but like all these
Too late.
things are set in
Yeah.
motion, like you can't do it.
A production
Yeah.
that massive, you can't just that's it's a ship stuck in the middle of the Suez Canal. Like, you can't just flip it around.
Right.
Like, it's there,
Right.
it's there. I think that's a thing that's, like, really interesting these days with I feel like these big film and movie companies, I know we're, like, way off your topic at this point, I apologize for that, but
No, no, no.
I feel like they've kind of created a little bit of a hell for themselves where they have tried to create TV shows that have a cinematic feel to them, but they
Mhm.
know they can't give them cinematic budgets because they don't make the kind of money that movies do in theaters, and you can't recoup your expenses with a streaming show the way you can. 'Cause even if you have, like, every streaming service has a ceiling of this is the viewers we're gonna get. We have a
Right.
monthly, we're getting that. It's like a weird trade-off of, like, you're getting money every month from them, but you're not gonna get more people. Whereas with movies, it's like, oh, we might make new money every single time one of these goes out. And so we'll make a big chunk at once and then also like future rights and stuff like that. And which also every company having their own streaming service also diminishes the money they're going to make on the back end of a film because they're no longer getting licensing rights and stuff like that because they're self. So
Right.
that's a whole thing. But I think a really good example of it is the way people talk about like House of the Dragons or even the Rings of Power. I always want to call it Power of the Ring. Even Rings of Power, which is the most expensive television show ever created,
Ever made.
ever
Ever.
made.
Yeah.
But if you break down the per episode, people have like, "Oh, that show has $1 billion budget." Yes, it does, for 5 seasons. It's $1 billion for 5 seasons, and when you break down the per episode budget for that show, it's high. It is the highest. It is 60 it's about $60 million an episode, which is a lot of money. It's also about a third of what each Peter Jackson film had for its budget as
Right.
part of a 3 trilogy that was shot together and was able to make some expenses because they were filming them all back to back. But, like,
Mhm.
and that was in 2000 and like, 2001, like, probably, like, 1990 when they were or 2000 when they were filming those. Like, people so I remember when that show came out, there was all this talk about, "Well, look how much cheaper the costumes look on this show versus how they looked in these films." And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, they're a lot cheaper. They Television does not ever have the budget that a film does, and it's not going to." And it's like, they are being super cheap, and they are cheaping out on stuff, and it kinda sucks, but at the same time, it's like, that's how you make Lord of the Rings for television, and you're doing it more
It's
expensive than
also
anybody else ever.
it's not a fair comparison either, because you could take Aragorn's costume from Return of the King and shoot it on the set of Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Rings of Rings of Rings, and it would look terrible because of the finishing process on those shows. Like, it's
Yeah.
shot in like 8K, maybe 16K. It's shot with all this digital intermediate stuff. Like, you could literally take the film costume and put it in the show, and it would not look as good. Like, the circumstances are just totally different. Like, it's not a reasonable comparison.
Yeah.
Well, so this is something interesting actually that makes this relevant because I think as fans of Doctor Who in particular, the special effects were never the point. The
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
the production value was never about the spectacle. It was about the idea and the idea of what it was supposed to be. It was always like gesturing at something.
Hmm.
And like even audiences at the time, like this wasn't convincing anybody that this was literally real. It was more representational, and that was good enough for what it had to do and had to be. And I think one of the differences between Star Wars and Doctor Who, specifically when they began, was I think Star Wars was very much about the spectacle and how quote unquote real it looked
Oh, yeah.
and how good the special effects are. That was one of the main selling points of Star Wars was that, like, you'd never seen sci-fi fantasy realized in this, like, real way, whereas Doctor Who, I don't know that was ever the intention. Like, that's not what they were
No.
ever trying to do
No,
necessarily.
to the point that I think, like, original Doctor Who was meant to be like a stage play. Like, that's how TV was made in that era, especially. And I think even American TV had that to a degree as well. Like, I think American
Very much
sitcoms
so.
especially were very stagey, and, like, even Star Trek does feel a little bit on stage. Like, it doesn't feel like a
Mhm.
Sure.
movie.
And it's probably also a money thing because in the States, certainly by the 1960s, drama shows would be shot on film, single camera 16 millimeter, which would lend itself to a much more cinematic style
Yeah.
because you're shooting for the edit. And for some reason, I guess kind of arbitrarily, although I don't know, sitcoms sort of remained that like theatrical proscenium where it's sort of performed as a stage play and the action is being captured as live essentially
Well,
by
it was
multiple
cheaper to
cameras.
film, yeah. They would use cheaper mate like, there's a whole it's famously the reason why Lucille Ball made so much money off of I Love Lucy and was able to then she and Desi were able to, turn RKO and Desilu and make Star Trek, all that kind of stuff is because when she was doing the first season of I Love Lucy, they wanted her and Desi to come to New York to do it because they were essentially filming sitcoms like live things, like, and, even if it went out, like, later that day, it was, like, a quality of, like, video print essentially, like, not videotape as we know it now, but, like, that's basically what it was, and if you try to do it, like, in LA and then ship it to New York or air it later, it would degrade so much that it would look bad, and she and Desi wanted to live in Los Angeles, they didn't wanna live in New York, and so it became a whole thing of how to produce it to where she finally was like, "Okay, if you spend the money to shoot this on film so that it doesn't degrade, we will give up X amount of dollars for our fee for doing the show, but we take over the back end instead." And then by doing so, she created a type of film that was a TV show that was then able to be resold as reruns, which previous shows wouldn't really be able to because they looked terrible if you did that. And then she made a bunch of money by then eventually selling those right back to, and I think it was NBC. Like she basically like made them give her the back end and then resold it to them for the back end and got all the money. It was kind of amazing.
So in that decision, actually, the fact that they shot I Love Lucy on film is the reason why they've scanned I Love Lucy film to be able to present the show in HD, and it looks amazing. It
Yeah,
like
Mhm.
yeah, but that is to say, like, that's not how TV,
was normally
certainly
done.
at the BBC, worked. Yeah. Once Star Wars hits, I think a couple things happen. I think suspension of disbelief or that forgiveness of an audience, in terms of the level of realism and production quality that they're willing to go along with, sort of change. I think that Doctor Who started looking more and more shoddy in comparison to what sci-fi was quote unquote supposed to look like. Like something that always blows my mind is when you remember that classic Who was on contemporaneously with the first couple seasons of Star Trek and Next Generation. And it's like if you could imagine like you're a sci-fi fan who's living in London and you're watching Colin Baker or Sylvester McCoy on Doctor Who, and then you flip the channel and you're seeing Star Trek The Next Generation, like the disparity in production quality is
Mhm.
quite immense.
Yeah, and part of that has to do with the fact that Doctor Who was being funded on a public television budget on a channel that did not want to have Doctor Who anymore, so they were basically
Mhm.
giving them
Well,
table
certainly at
scraps
that
to
point,
make the
yes.
show.
Right.
Like the BBC hated Doctor Who at that point. They hated sci-fi in general. Like the people running the BBC were embarrassed to have sci-fi on their channel. And so like they were looking for all the reasons to gut everything they could with it. So it was a really interesting time period for it.
Oh, no, yeah, and there's that famous clip of Michael Grade, I believe either the head of drama or the BBC controller at that time, the one who really had it out for Doctor Who. He was on a talk show in the early '90s, and they asked him like why he canceled the show, and he was like, "Well, because I'd seen Star Wars and I'd seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and then I look at what we're doing, and it's just like, what is this garbage or rubbish?" I guess he would have
Yeah.
said, but
It's like if you had given them the money to make the show, they would have made it as good as that was. It's such a and they I mean, look, they tried their best. That they're trying really hard to make it look good. Yeah.
no, no, and that's actually one of the things that I really enjoy about particularly classic Doctor Who, but I think it still sort of applies, and we can talk about that in a second. But like the fact that it's clear what they're working with and how hard they're trying. And sometimes you can see maybe that they're not trying very hard, but like, having the context of like how many weeks and weeks and like how many serials they're making and like where they are in the year and how much money they must have. It's like, I don't know, maybe I'm particularly idiosyncratic in this way, but there's something that I appreciate more about seeing the seams versus something that looks pristine and perfect on like a technical level. I think because you get the sense of like the human fingerprints there. Like if
Yeah.
that makes any sense, it's sort of like
Mhm.
like that makes me feel like this is a bespoke thing that somebody worked on and really cared about and they're like really trying to make like there's a humanness that's there, like a
Yeah,
humanity.
I agree with that. There's a tangible life to it.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
versus, something that may look slick and pristine and, like, technically perfect, but that's not like, I kind of don't really know what to do with that, like, I don't really care about that. It's, like, great that you can make that look like that, but that also looks exactly the same as everything else, and, like, I don't really care about that, like, what are you here for?
Yeah, I think that's, like, a lot of what you see in superhero movies especially is, like, you get a lot of this, like, homogenized visuals, but then you're like, "But was there a good story to it? Like, did I care about the characters or what they were doing or what their involvement was? Or was it just, like, all like transitive setup for a big punch fight with robots, basically?" And it's like, I care or do I not care? Whereas, like, when I feel like that's why I think I still have such a passion for stop motion animation and, like, puppetry and stuff like that. 'Cause I'm like, wow, somebody had to go through and, like, manually design each of those armatures and each of those things and put it together, and versus, like, "Oh, I just made this," like, I just built a, CGI thing and told it and gave it AI to do what it wanted to do, which is, like, itself impressive, but there is something
Right.
about the effort that, like, belied in the storytelling, and it kind of, like, I think we're going back to what we're saying about what great about Andor is, like, physically going to a space and, like, set dressing that space and putting people in it really, like, leads to thoughtful and interesting points of view in the storytelling.
I mean, there is something about like, whenever somebody complains about like the CG in Star Wars or something, like in particular in the prequels, like my thing was always, well, not to say you're wrong to not be satisfied by whatever's on offer, but like it's not that like the AT-ATs in the Battle of Hoth like looked real, right? Like
That's yeah, that's not the point. Yeah.
like
Mhm.
I do think there is something to be said for, with stop motion, it's like clear that human hands made this happen. And I think
That's yeah.
subconsciously you feel that. It's like you see it or feel something like there is that is imbued with something that you can't really articulate or even put your finger on exactly what it is, but it's something that just feels you're more accepting of. It feels like less alienating, I guess.
I'm not watching the AT-AT for the compositing. I'm watching it for all the little greebles and all the little styrene bits and bobs that make up that thing. Like going back to Andor, like as cool as the Fondor looks, Skarsgård's ship, as cool as it looks on the outside, the coolest part of that ship is the little three camera lens droid mod thing that's like, hello, I am a practical little spinny guy. And you're like, that, yes. As cool as all the CG bullshit looks, like the coolest thing of that set is still like, there's a weird little camera guy who's like in a ball and he's talking and it's cool. Like,
No, yeah, that's like pulled off like a Super 8 film camera
mhm.
from the 60s with like
Oh,
the
there
turret.
was yeah, there's a pair of binoculars in the Aldani heist stuff in Andor where I was just like, I've held that camera. I know exactly what they hollowed
I
out
know exactly what
with
you're talking
these
about. It has like the
binoculars.
grill on the front. It's got like the silver sort
Yes.
of like a
They
yeah,
just
yeah,
added a little like eyeball
yeah,
thing to the side of this camera. And I'm like, you clever little devils. Like that's
yeah.
so well done.
Because,
Uh
that's a
uh
lot of what Star Wars the original production design for the original Star Wars is so genius, and, what they're often attempting to recreate when they do live action in that time period is, like, they are trying to create these British designers raiding junkyards and prop houses in 1976 and just gluing shit together.
Well, that's I mean, going back to that, the original sonic screwdriver is a prop from a Thunderbirds movie.
Oh,
Like
is that true?
they're the John Pertwee, well, not the original sonic screwdriver. Like the original sonic screwdriver was like a pen light, but the John Pertwee one with the spiral on the middle bit there. There's terms for all these things. That is literally a prop from one of the Thunderbirds feature films, used in
I
one of the
mean,
like
no, I
close-ups with a
believe it.
human
And, like,
hand, you know?
famously, Michael Myers' mask in Halloween, they took a William
Oh my
Shatner
god.
mask and made it into less of a
Yes.
monster.
Yes, there's a really funny
That was a long
Columbo.
walk to get to a dumb joke, but I'm glad y'all came with me on it.
Oh, it was worth it. There's a Columbo episode where William Shatner wears a blue jumpsuit, and it's like, "Oh, it's a strange prequel for the Halloween films." Uh,
So let me ask both of you, do you think the modern series of Doctor Who, because it obviously exists in like a post Star Wars modern blockbuster sort of sci-fi environment, do you think that Doctor Who's approach to special effects and spectacle has changed, or like has the show changed in the way that it has to utilize special effects just given the way contemporary film and TV works?
I would say so. I think the same way that Star Trek had to. I think Star Trek, like Next Generation, couldn't look like '60s Star Trek. It had to look like a new TV era, and
Right.
similarly, like I do think that if Doctor Who had tried to keep doing it the way they had done it back in the, 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think that it wouldn't have lasted very long. And I think they basically it's not that I don't think that that era was also not trying to do that either. I think they just had the budgets they had and they had to work with them. And I think same
Right.
thing with the 2005 series. I think a lot of the stuff in the 2005 series, I mean, especially the very first season, the Eccleston run, there's some janky stuff in that looking back on it now,
mhm.
but because, like,
I got
BBC
those
wasn't
Blu-rays and whew,
yeah, and
woo-hoo!
BBC wasn't giving them a ton of money, and, like, this might work, this might not, we're not gonna, like, sink too much into it right away. Like, it's wild when you can compare what's been happening. Like, I think there's a lot of things that I still dislike about, the most recent era, but the level of production value to it is comparatively it's night and day, and so, yeah, I do think there's some level of that.
Well, I would agree with that last thing you said. If you compare the most recent of the Chibnall seasons to, say, the very beginning or even the end of the Russell era. But, like, I think the Moffat era, by and large, I prefer the way it looks to the last 3 series of the
Oh, I
Chibnall
agree with
stuff.
that.
So it is really interesting. It's not just money and technology, it's also, like, how you utilize it.
I will say though, particularly in the eras you're pointing out, technology is a huge factor in how those shows look.
Agreed.
For sure.
Like the original Davies era, most of that was still shot on like beta, like HD
Yeah.
beta tape, which
Mhm.
is why there's only like a certain level of quality is only ever going to be achievable from those
Yeah.
tapes. Like you can't remaster to a certain point. They didn't even switch over to HD until the Tennant specials, right?
Right.
And then the reason the Moffat era, the first year of Smith in particular looks the way it does is because they put in the investment in like Alexa cameras and like really trying to focus on the optics of the show. And then I think similarly, the Chibnall era has fallen victim to like the over processing of a lot of
Mhm.
streaming television,
Yeah.
where you can just fix it in the computer, right? Or you just add a very ubiquitous particle filter to anything, and suddenly you've got cool energy, right? Whereas before you've had to like actually do animations on those things, right? Like it is the ubiquity of those technologies that does affect the way they look.
Yeah, and I
Um,
was gonna say even the switch over from beta to digital was almost
mm,
a forced hand situation, which is essentially this is something I know mostly because of my day job working in, like, captioning and stuff like that, is we saw a major shift away from beta to digital almost overnight in a way that the industry doesn't normally move to so quickly. Up until this point, most of the like whenever we were sending videos out to like broadcasting companies and like network affiliates and stuff like that, we were having to do manual encoded like beta to beta transfers and stuff like that. And everyone was still running off of beta. But what happened was the tsunami in Japan destroyed the factories that made beta tapes, like, on a massive
Really?
scale, and so it
whoa.
became a thing where suddenly it became way more expensive to make beta tapes because there were so much less facilities to do it at,
Huh.
and so the price of beta went way up, and, like, this is my experience as someone, like, boots on the ground, not someone who's, like, researched it as, like, a trend, but almost within a year or 2 of when this started to happen, almost every, like, local station basically made a light years level of jump in technology, and these were all people who were, like, they don't have a huge budget. They were always pretty like they were glacier like pacing and moving into newer material. And then suddenly all we had these like decks in our office that were, worth like five figures and they were like pretty expensive. And then they became obsolete overnight almost. Like within a year or two, they went from being a thing we used every day to a thing we wouldn't use once every 6 months. And now we don't even have them anymore. And it's
Mm.
wild. I think that even on the production level, they were like, we can't make stuff on beta anymore because we don't have the ability to keep getting new beta tapes and to manufacture them and to put them out the studios. And now affiliates aren't even using beta anymore, so we're putting it all on digital anyway.
Yeah, and even practically within the production, one of the big reasons they switched to HD in the Tenet specials is literally there's a shot in The Waters of Mars where he like slow motion walks towards camera, and you can't do that on HD beta. Like one of the big reasons they switched is because slow motion looks terrible on tape. They literally made the part of that production switch. Some of that investment was like, oh, we can do cool slow mo, which is like just the
That's interesting.
practicalities of the technology. Again, is
And
like
Yeah.
even the cost of
we're
technology.
way off topic, but
But then, yeah,
still, like, yeah, it's
but
Right.
it
fun.
makes sense with Star Wars as well. Like it's the cost of technology eventually goes down, and
Mm,
so you can do what you used to not be able to do at the budget of what you used to be able to do. So that's like, I mean, like all these shows have obviously had a little bit of increase in their budget, but I would say out of all of them, up until possibly the future now in Doctor Who, they have never had a major increase in their budget because all their budget's coming from public funding and like a little bit of licensing, and that's about
mm.
it. And so Doctor Who's hands have really been tied by what they can do money wise. And I think, and so like the reason why the Chibnall era looks the way it does because they could finally afford to do the things that Chibnall's era does with it, for better or for worse. And I think that it's almost I think of like I think Moffat's era looks better to me because they didn't have access to some stuff and they had to kind of make do what they had. And as a result, I think it
Mm.
looks a little back to what you were saying, Josh, about having your hands on it and having to like make really conscious choices about things. Now there are definitely things in the Moffat era that look ridiculous, but I do think that's one thing. I think the Moffat era is definitely the best looking of the three modern eras, and I think that Russell has some things that are almost laughably bad during his era as far as how they look, and how much of that is his fault and how much of that is like production stuff is pretty clear, but it is wild.
Well, yeah. So the other interesting thing too is that both of you just reminded me, once again, like in 2005, that was still shot for standard definition, right?
Mhm.
And one of the reasons why they waited so long to make the transition to digital HD was because the cost of all of the CGI would quadruple, like just because you'd have to render it at a higher resolution, which not only means the render time is longer, but it also means it needs to be more detailed. You can't get away with things you used to be able to get away with. And so when you watch those early seasons of the modern show, like some of them do not hold up very well at all. But what is interesting is that I still think that while the technology and the budget was obviously higher for the modern incarnation, even all the way back to 2005, as compared to the classic series, I think it was still like relationally still similar to where it was like on the pecking order of production value. Like I still
Oh,
think it was like
absolutely.
on the low end, like we are bursting at the seams, utilizing all our resources to pull off impossible things. What I do think is really going to be interesting to see now for series 14 or whatever it is, the first of the shooty seasons or the 15th Doctor. I read the other day that along with the Disney Plus distribution deal, the money they're getting from that means the budget per episode, I think, for modern Doctor Who right now, like as of the Chibnall era, was like £1 to £3 million
Yeah,
per episode, which is low
Mm.
for a show to be made now.
absolutely. It's amazing the show looks as good as it does for how low the budget is, to be honest with you.
That again
Yes.
is a testament to the ubiquity of technology, like the
Yeah.
upgrading of
Yeah.
technology over the years.
But next series, I believe it will be more like 9 to 10
Yeah, they said
million
it's about
pounds
a
an episode.
tripled budget, so it's gonna be really interesting to see where that money goes, what they do with it. I hope it goes to the writing budget a little bit more.
I think the TARDIS interior is gonna be an AR wall.
So it's interesting because, like, there's something charming to what Doctor Who tries to do with the resources that it has,
Yeah.
um, that I really respond to. I'm not trying to be patronizing when I say that. It's just like
I
there's
don't think you sound
something.
patronizing at all.
Mm,
Well,
mm,
yeah. So my fear with the Disney Plus factor and the increased money, but also like what they will want the show to to be. And again, we don't know how much creative influence they will have. The production diary in the new issue of Doctor Who magazine says that they sent the early cuts of the three specials to BBC and to Disney for notes. So it's not that they have like zero input. But my concern is that we're going to lose that
Charminess.
charm,
Mhm.
that energy that comes out because of the disparity from like how high the reach versus the reach of its grasp. It's like
Sure.
that like tension there between the ambition of what they're trying to do versus the resources that they have to pull it off. And the only thing that I can think of that kind of gives me some hope about that is like, if you read Russell T Davies' The Writer's Tale, which charts the production history from like the end of series 3 through I think the end of the Tenant specials, the things that they would have to lose for budgetary reasons, like the Shadow Proclamation in Journey's End or the Soul and Earth or whatever at the end of series 4 was supposed to be like a gigantic who's who of the universe and like a massive thing. And then it ended up like three aliens in like an office block or
Yeah, I was
something.
gonna
It's
say they used like Bill's office. We're like, it's gonna.
Yeah.
I don't know who Bill is. I just made them up.
like stuff like that when it's here's what we actually really wanted and we had to scale it down for whatever reason, like that's fine. I mean, it just means that okay, like now they won't have to make those sorts of compromises. But like my I don't even want to say fear, but like my sort of question mark in my head is like, what will this mean for the kind of show that it is, right?
Yeah. Well, I
I don't know
think
if that makes any sense.
my response to that is we just had a long conversation about the way that Disney Plus Star Wars shows look compared to the films and how, Andor looked compared to, the volume shot episodes of Obi-Wan and
Everything
stuff like
else.
that. So I think that even though we're getting a bigger budget, we're not getting a film budget. We're getting 10 million
True.
episode, which is higher than Doctor Who has ever had, but it's by far not comparatively higher than like what the industry standard is for this kind of TV making and stuff like that. So I don't think that we're moving into an era where Doctor Who will now have the money to do whatever they want to do every time they want to do it and never have to work around it. I don't think that charm is going to be completely off of it. And I think honestly, like, as we just discussed with the Chibnall era, I think some of that charm has already kind of been sanded off a little bit because of the way the technology met what they were doing. I think that like it feels like they're already trying to do a show that's visually on par with what's happening in the industry already. But I think that the Chibnall era, especially, the low quality of the visuals stopped being as charming as they were in Moffat, in Russell, in late '80s Doctor Who. I think that it's like the market nowadays will not allow it to be what it used to be. For me, I think the gold standard of what Doctor Who should try to accomplish is what Star Trek just did with Strange New Worlds, where I think Strange
Mhm.
New Worlds feels very, very much in the visual language of classic Star Trek, while also marrying it to the Discovery era technology. When the Abrams movies technology was then made cheap enough to make TV shows with. Because I think Strange New Worlds feels so nostalgic for old '60s Star Trek, while also feeling very modern and new. And I think if
Mm.
Doctor Who, and I think that's what Andor is doing really well too, is Andor is really feeling like a hard-boiled '70s spy thriller that also feels like a show made in 2022 and 2020 and stuff like
Mhm.
that. But that's what I think Doctor Who's high watermark is. Like, if that's what Doctor Who is striving for, of like, how do we make a show that can use what's available to us and have all the paint in our paintbrush, but still embrace the aesthetic of what the show has always been? And, we haven't talked as much about thematic stuff as I think we wanted to because we got so excited about production stuff. But at the end of the day, Doctor Who has to come down to the hearts of the series, right? It has to come down to that empathy and that love and stuff like that. And like, as long as that is still there, I think you can kind of be willing to let them have more of a bigger playground with the production because the soul of the show remains. And I think that's what's so great
Mhm.
about Strange New Worlds is Strange New Worlds really gets the soul of what Star Trek is but is able to use a modern paintbrush for it. And again, Andor tells a new, it's a much colder, more brutal Star Wars than we've ever seen depicted. It's like it's all the brutalism and coldness that was always there, but it's making it the front and center, and not as much the
Yes.
like lingering the glory of hope that you have in a lot of other Star Wars stuff, where you don't have a lot of you have none of the Jedi mysticism that's always present in other Star Wars properties, which Michael and I can debate back and forth as good or bad. But like, and this is
Neutral.
now my tangent completely off this side. But I had a friend recently who I follow on Twitter, I've been on podcasts with, who was talking about why he doesn't like Andor, and the reason why is because he comes to Star Wars for Jedi mysticism, which I do as well. Like that is my primary Star Wars love is Jedi and Sith and weird Force, like metaphysics and stuff like that. Having said that, then he said in the tweet thread, he said to himself, like, maybe someday Tony Gilroy will do a Jedi style story with this, and I'm like, you don't want that. You do not
No, you
want
don't.
Tony Gilroy to do what Tony Gilroy does with Jedi. What makes Andor so great is that Tony Gilroy is telling a story that could easily be a Cold War drama set in East Berlin with the exact same characters, the exact same story beats, and just exchanging empire for the Soviet Union and things like that. And like this, the way people have to compromise and change themselves to survive. And that's why it works great. If you start giving them laser swords and mystical force abilities, you're going to undercut the story that's being told. Like what you want is not Tony Gilroy to make a Andor-like series about Jedi. You want somebody who's really good at telling those kinds of stories to do what Tony Gilroy is doing with Andor. You want, like, that's why, like, I would love if Rian Johnson was given his trilogy we keep talking about, or if Rian Johnson was given a Star Wars TV series to be able to like Rian Johnson all over the place. I'm trying to think of another filmmaker right now who I would love to see be given the paintbrush of Jedi and Sith and those things, and how they could work within their own visual storytelling language, but using Star Wars as a backdrop. But yeah, I think to go circle back to your original point, like I think that those are examples of what can be done with the budgets they're being given, with the space they're being put in, and with the history of what the production does. And I think if Doctor Who makes that, if that's the tennis ball they hang up to look at in this new CGI world they have, I think they'll be okay.
No, I think that's really well said. I think you're right on the money with that.
I think sort of another way of summing up some of what we've been talking about, whatever this thought is, here it comes. Original Doctor Who and Star Wars, like going back to El Sandifer's thesis about like Doctor Who is a show that crashes into other shows, and Star Wars is very much a movie series inspired by other movies. You know, Kurosawa, that's the one that pops to mind, but a thousand other things too. Even Hokkaido,
John Ford westerns and
yes,
yeah,
space westerns,
yeah,
very much Joseph Campbell,
yeah,
et cetera, et cetera. Like those stories were, I think those both franchises are really strong when they understand that it's about like crashing their show into other shows, or like their franchise into other franchises. Like Andor works because it's Star Wars meets 3 Days of the Condor, right? 3 Days of the Andor. Um, Thank you. I was holding on to that one for a little bit, and I'm glad it
It's
worked.
good. It's very good.
I might steal
But
that for an episode title in the future, but
go for it.
I will.
I mean, your recap. I'm excited for your recap of the next couple. But where you run into trouble is like, I think some of the issue, but just personal opinion stuff. Here we go. I think some of the issues that the first few Star Wars series, like the Disney stuff, ran into is that it was Star Wars trying to make Star Wars stories. In the
Right.
same way that I feel like when Doctor Who's at its weakest, it's Doctor Who trying to crash into a Doctor Who story. It's
Right.
like the lore is not the strongest part. I think there's like there's like misunderstanding there of that, or not even, I don't know if it's misunderstanding, maybe it's just my personal interest in the things, but it's like, I think Andor is as strong as it is because it's not trying to be like you've both said, it's not trying to be like a Star Wars story about Star
Yeah.
Wars. It's like a story about, and answering the thematic question we've been, dancing around the whole time, is it's like, it's both franchises have this delicate tightrope walk of anti-fascism on one end and colonialism on the other end. And
Yes.
they're always very delicately balancing those two things, because you can both franchises picked heroes who go to worlds, find things that are messed up, fix them, right? But there's something innately colonial about that, right? There's imagery in both franchises that borrows from like really bad stuff, like you were talking about like the British imperial thing, but the thing that always strikes me is like the big final award scene in A New Hope, episode 4, or aka original Star Wars. Like it's straight up trying for the Will Lenny Riefenstahl shit. Like
Right.
I always like to say, like the reason Chewie doesn't get an award is he's like, I don't want to be a part of this Nazi movie bullshit, thank you very much. Like he knows the references, and he's like, no, like I'm good.
Well, I mean, he also
uh
knows what happened when the Republic came to his world offering to save it, right? Like he
Yes,
knows.
like
Yeah.
back to the colonial yes, exactly. Is like he know that, and that is some retroactive stuff there, but that's also really accurate for that. It's like he's had this innate experience with it, the colonialist side versus the anti-fascist side.
I think that's probably
No.
what I was gonna say before we even sat down to talk today. My thought about the differences between Star Wars and Doctor Who is that on both sides there are exceptions to this rule. I mean, obviously Star Wars famously, like Luke wins by throwing away his sword, so that is part of it. But they still blow up the Death Star, right? So like I
Mhm.
think that, and like yes, Doctor Who still blows up a fleet of Cybermen when he has to, and he does occasionally be like, yes, please kill all the Daleks before they get out of this space. That is part of Doctor Who. But at the end of the day, Doctor Who is a story about how everybody can fix problems by sitting down and talking them out, whereas Star Wars is a story about you must destroy fascists at every possible turn. Like I think that at the end of the day, Star Wars is a much more inherently violent story and
Mm.
much less empathetic story that does weave in this element of like you still have to make peace with yourself and you have to make peace with the universe around you, but you also have to oppose like a totalitarianism in every corner. Whereas Doctor Who always eventually tries to come back to even the most totalitarian dictators are ultimately usually misunderstood or have some flaw. Like it's weird because Doctor Who's primary antagonists are a Nazi allegory. Like, right, that's what the Daleks, and I think that maybe that's also the difference between Doctor Who and Star Wars is that Doctor Who very much deals in allegory, whereas Star Wars does kind of have literal totalitarianism. But like I do think that like at the end of the day, even in classic Doctor Who, which I think is not as high on the empathy aspect that modern Who is, like as a foreground thing, I would say, still comes down to Origin of the Daleks or Genesis of the Daleks, where Tom Baker is like, I do not have the right to stop the Daleks from existing at the beginning of their creation. Like I don't have the right to connect these two strands and eradicate and create a genocide. Whereas Star Wars in the very first movie is like, yes, we should blow up this world-killing space station so it can't kill more worlds. And everybody who's on that station, their life is sacrificed because they've worked for this organization, and we're not even going to think twice. Like we're going to celebrate it and be happy about it. And I don't think either point of view is necessarily wrong, but they are very extreme approaches to often the same type of enemy and foe.
It's it's something else Alexander never talks about. It's the gun versus frock debate. It never
Right.
ends. It's always going to be guns versus frocks, which
No,
is
that's
like
actually very
mm-hmm.
well put. It's almost in the titles, right? It's like Star Wars and,
Doctor
Doctor
Who. Yeah,
Who,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're broadly, vaguely, kind of anti-authoritarian, even though the soil that they grew in, like, definitely has those imperialist and colonialist,
Yeah.
histories.
Mhm.
One thing I do think is interesting, like, and this is something that I'm sure that I cribbed from El Sandifer, when she talks about that moment in Genesis of the Daleks where Tom Baker, he has to decide whether or not he is going to completely wipe out the Daleks once and for all, and he has the very famous "Do I have that right?" speech. He doesn't make a decision that he does not have the right. He's asking the question, and then he gets interrupted because he waited too long. Right. And you could argue that he then later on has decided that he made a mistake back then because he does destroy Skaro in remembrance of the Daleks. And later on, he destroys the Daleks and the Time Lords in the Time War. So
Well,
it's
actually,
interesting.
he saved the Time
Yeah,
Lords,
oh,
and the
yeah.
Daleks destroyed each other. So, you could say that that's and also I'm gonna say that he didn't do a very good job destroying the Daleks. Like,
But yeah,
Yeah, he
Fair enough.
he
that's also the problem
really
with.
blew it.
I mean, I think it's weird because I think that it's not that Star Wars necessarily has a single authorial language. And maybe it does during the Lucas era, but I
I
would
think it
say
used to,
post
and now
Lucas
it doesn't.
era, it
Yeah.
doesn't. And you're getting whereas like I think Doctor Who more so has always
Mm.
handed off its voice to a new. 'Cause Doctor Who has much more of a comic book thing of like this writer has the show for this period of time, and this is their time with the show. And then anything there are some themes that are consistent throughout, perhaps, but it is always a new voice telling a similar story
Yes.
until today.
Yes, you I think have hit the nail on the head. Like that is a very important distinction that hadn't occurred to me, but you're absolutely right. Like the authorial voice of Doctor Who is never consistent.
Even in classic era, Terrence Dicks and Robert Holmes had very,
Yeah.
very different points of view about
Yeah,
Doctor Who. And some of the best eras are when they're almost having an argument about what Doctor Who should be. And because they
yeah,
change roles, they go back and forth. They write, sometimes one of them's a script editor and the other one's writing episodes and vice versa.
right.
And I think that makes like I appreciate both of what they're bringing to. I think when I first watched Classic Who, I was a Robert Holmes fan. I think having gone through and like really seen how they both do things, I kind of like the Terrence Dicks Robert Holmes dichotomy of Doctor Who.
No, you're exactly right. Like that's a very good example. Like the tension between them and just the different eras in conversation with other eras. It's like Doctor Who is very much this kind of accidentally great thing that is always sort of running with whatever it has at the moment. It's like, okay, well, we need to produce another 6 stories of television for the next 6 months. We just got to make it happen. And some very interesting things come out of that. Rewrite the essential like lore or the origin of where the Doctor comes from. Robert Holmes actually does. He rewrites himself a couple of times versus Star Wars, which, I mean, like you pointed out, up until the recent era was very much this one singular vision from one person.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I
and
would
even
say
though
the
that
classic
evolved,
trilogy is more collaborative than, but yeah, it springs from his mind and then is working with a lot of
yeah,
collaborators to make it.
yes,
Whereas
yes, yes, yes,
then the
yes.
prequels are very much his vision. And then I think even Clone Wars, you kind of start seeing like it started out George Lucas's vision still, and then kind of got handed off to people as he kind of pulled away from it a little bit. Yeah, I don't think we really get that level of contentious Star Wars storytelling until Last Jedi, and I think that Last Jedi, and I think that, and that might be part of why it was so, aside from the toxic reasons why it was rejected. I think part of the
Yes.
reasons why people who are like good people who didn't like it are people who had come up with like Star Wars has always been very much one thing, and this thing is trying to kind of like deconstruct that a little bit, and I don't like that. I do. I'm speaking for some. I love Last Jedi, but
Yes,
speaking for
yes.
their voices. But I also think like the only projects aside from Last Jedi that I think are still really doing that are I think that Andor absolutely. I think to a lesser degree Obi-Wan was starting to do a little bit. And then I think there's a lot of that in the High Republic. I think the High Republic's doing a great job of recontextualizing the height of the Republic as also being like it's really going, okay, well, if this organization is this like corrupt and fallible by the time George Lucas got to the prequels, it didn't just start that way. Like, let's go to a period
Yeah.
of time where Republic is kind of like it's fascinating reading those books because I went into them thinking like, oh, cool, I get to see stories of Jedi at their most heroic and at the height of their like largesse. And the shockingly, those books do a great job at yes depicting that, but also pointing out how much of it is a lie and how much of it's a false facade. Because I think one of the most fascinating things about Star Wars is the fact that the Jedi are always wrong. Like the Jedi's
Yeah.
belief system about attachments is proven wrong in every era of like Star Wars that we know of, and yet they stick to it. And I mean, we're even seeing it with Mandalorian, where even Ahsoka, who has been burned by the Jedi, is even she saying he's too attached to you or whatever. And yet every single time a Jedi character is victorious, it's because they lean into their attachments. It's why Luke and Vader are able to defeat Palpatine. It's why Rey is able to defeat Palpatine because she cares about the people in her life that matter to her. It's why Ahsoka is able to defeat, temporarily, not fully, but Anakin in, the temple because it's like in Rebels, everybody talks about Ahsoka's line of "I am no Jedi," and the problem is they always take it completely out of context and they just use it as like, yeah, she's rejecting being a Jedi. No, she's not. What she's doing in that scene, and I I was so glad because Michael's greatest enemy, Dave Filoni, said this in an interview to some degree.
I hope we're not enemies.
I'm kidding. He said it in an interview around when she first appeared on Mandalorian, and I was like pumping my fists in triumph. People still quote that line incorrectly, but Ahsoka says, "I am no Jedi." But the context she's saying it in is Anakin. She says to Anakin, like she says to Vader. Vader says Anakin is dead. She says, "Then I will avenge him." And he's like, "Vengeance is not a Jedi trait." And she says, "I am no Jedi." That is Ahsoka psyching herself up to believe that she has what it takes to kill this person she's fighting. And like I don't think she means it. I think she's trying to say, like, I won't hesitate. But then what happens in that same fight is the second the mask breaks, both physically and metaphorically, and you have that brief moment of Anakin reaching out to her the same way he does to Obi-Wan in the Obi-Wan series and says, like, Ahsoka, the second that happens, her entire position on the motion, like she has mercy for him again. That is her Jedi coming back to her. And it's like, it is such a thing of like, I could go on for a long time, and I have done it already, about how Ahsoka is the best Jedi at being a Jedi because she's let go of the attachment to being a Jedi that the Jedi have. So like she epitomizes the ideal of what a good Jedi is because she's not a Jedi, quote unquote, in a way that like I think Obi-Wan's maybe like the closest you can get to it of someone who's actually a Jedi. But now I'm rambling, I'm sorry. But like,
No,
yeah,
I love it. That's great.
I think that like it's kind of fascinating that Star Wars has gone on for as long as it has by having a protagonist group that is inherently wrong at the center of it and never felt like they have to. I remember I was thinking like how I really wish that Luke's Jedi school would have like leaned into that a little bit more, but it's like, oh yeah, if it had, then it would still be around and like Ben wouldn't have
It would have
broken and he
worked.
wouldn't have come
Yeah.
out. Like,
Yeah.
and if you do a future Jedi stuff after like the sequel era and you do lean into that as being with the Jedi, like now you have to change what the conflict is in the story because if they figure it out, like there's not really much conflict left. So it's
Well, so
Yeah.
so what's really interesting about what you just said and ties into like the authorial voice thing is I don't know that George Lucas realized how flawed the Jedi philosophy was. I think
Mm.
he knew that they had kind of started to lose their way, but I think he really believed that Jedi at the end of the day were inherently good and correct in what they were doing. It's just that they weren't right for the moment and were destroyed. Like I think he maybe had a blind spot in certain respects where I think his own vision for what they were and why they fell and what their flaws potentially were, I think was a little muddled because I think the story dictated that they had to mess up and create Anakin and allow for the rise of the Empire. But I think he was so in love with his own creation that he wasn't able to present them as wrong, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I'm curious because I don't know what side of that position I fall down on because I think there's times where I feel like you do, and there's times where I feel like there's depth, and it's hard because I'm so clouded now by having watched the Clone Wars series that I don't
Right.
know like a lot of my feelings on the prequels are now informed by the like scaffolding that Clone Wars built under the prequels to hold it up a little bit better.
Exactly.
But I do think like there are things in Revenge of the Sith especially where I do feel like he's at least implying that their own arrogance or their own like hubris led to their own downfall to some degree. Like I do think like,
Sure.
but there are elements of it where it's like, is he saying that, or is he saying that Palpatine did a great job of making Anakin think that? Like, there's a really good. It's hard
Right.
to tell. Because I think it's
Yeah.
I want to give George a little more credit towards it than just like blanketly being like, oh, he accidentally stumbled on this weird, like flawed government. The only thing I'll say is he does seem to know a lot about his feelings on imperialism and things like that when he makes the original trilogy. So I do think that he's bringing that into the prequels as well, but maybe not as nuanced as we think it might have intended to be and how it's become since then as people have reacted to it.
I would agree with that. Yeah, completely.
And I think that comes into Doctor Who very well too, because I think that like I think the British point of view on their own imperialism really evolved and grew over the course of the latter
While
half.
Doctor Who was on.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Classic and modern.
No,
Yeah.
no, 100%.
Like, I think in the 60s, people writing Doctor Who very much were in the mindset of, like, we were great and the Nazis sucked, and that's like because they're all people who lived during World War II, to some degree, even if they were especially if they were children. Because if you're a child in World War II, you very much have the mindset of, like, we were the good guys, and the Nazis were the bad guys. And then you get into that no empire area, ex-empire area of the UK, and you get through the, like, 60s and 70s and into the 80s of the Margaret Thatcher era, like, you're viewing the UK in your own country. Same way, like, in America, like, I think, like, can you imagine someone like Independence Day, like, if that movie was made now, how very
Yeah.
different it would feel to have a speech at the end of a movie that's, like, that jingoistic. I don't think you could do it nowadays. And maybe, I mean, I think now you get Marvel movies where even though they're being funded by the US military and they're very much tools of US military, propaganda, you still also have to have stuff like hidden Hydra agents within the US government, and you have to have characters like Captain America, who definitely does not just jingoistically follow the American ideal. It's very fascinating how much more even the, like, good guys and bad guys type stories have to then still have shades of gray with government because the audience doesn't trust the government the way they used to. It's really interesting.
Yeah,
No,
even
that
if
is
I feel like you could, you're right. Like if Steve Rogers was like Independence Day is a global holiday, people would still be like, now it would be like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Excuse
Yeah,
me?
Steve Rogers,
Like
who
it
was
would,
like he was like
it
the
wouldn't
yeah,
work. Like, yeah,
yeah,
it's
it's
like it.
fascinating.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
no, it's incredibly fascinating. I think there's a whole other episode in there, certainly for Star Wars. But final question, just to close things out. You have to take one season of Doctor Who and one Star Wars film or TV series with you to a desert island. What are you taking?
I have my answers, but after you, I'm
I had
surprised
to
how
think of
quickly I know. But like,
Okay.
for me, it'd be Star Wars: The Last Jedi because I like it a lot, um, and Doctor Who Series 9 because it is like the best of, I think, the modern era in my opinion.
No,
Series
I
9
like
just
that.
has it all. Mostly it has Heaven Sent, which I could just watch every day.
Oh,
Like, come on,
chef's
it's
kiss.
like, oh, maybe I would take Rogue One. I don't know. That's hard.
the problem with Rogue One is if you're already on a desert island, do you really want to watch that Scarif scene over and over again on a desert island?
Oh, that's a really
No,
good
that's true.
point.
Like,
Ooh,
I mean, granted, like,
that's a really good point.
that scene alone, like, that movie really shows you what Gilroy can do once. I mean, I know he just wrote it, he didn't direct it, but still, like, when you get to Andor, because I remember after Rogue One thinking, like, this is the best depiction of a Star War that I've ever seen in Star Wars. Like, this,
I
like, yeah,
Yes, I think to this day, Rogue One is the best dogfights in the franchise.
yeah.
Like the best fighter to fighter combat stuff
And
is in Rogue
juxtaposed with
One.
the commando stuff
It's like
happening on the ground, like the special forces,
exactly.
essentially, not intentionally special forces,
Mhm,
but, you know, I
mhm,
I do
mhm.
love that the comics retconned it so that, like, Rogue Squadron is literally named after Rogue One, and, like, literally, like,
Yeah.
they're doing what they're doing in the name of Jyn Erso. Perfect.
Hell
The
yeah.
comic series where that happens is maybe my favorite of the mainline Star Wars comics, where I forget the name of the planet now that, like, betrays them, and it's towards the end of the post New Hope going into Empire run of the Star Wars comics. There's
Mm.
this really, really great arc where they basically, like, there's this planet that has a very, like, I forget the name of it now off the top of my head, because I'm really, despite having written multiple Star Wars books, I'm really bad at pulling names and trivia for anything. But, like, they're like this planet that, like, builds ships essentially, and they make an alliance with them, but they've actually been working for Vader this whole time. Like the queen of this world is, like, basically Vader's puppet, and she basically betrays the rebellion. And so then they're, like, about to have this huge battle, and all their ships lock down, and they can't control them anymore because it's been, like, this, like, weird, and it becomes this, like, this desperate fight to, like, get out of this battle now. And, like, Luke jumps in, like, Luke is flying, and he's, like, recently learned about what happened at Rogue One, like, it's supposed to have just happened in the story. And so then he, like,
Mm.
he's like, okay, well, in honor of Jyn Erso and what happened at Scarif, we're gonna call ourselves, like, I guess, yeah, it would be after Rogue One because it's after The New Hope.
That's
Well,
how they got
Star
the
Wars, yeah,
plans. Yeah.
right.
yeah, but it's my favorite of that era of I think it's like close to the end of Kieran Gillen's run writing the comics, and it's just a truly cinematic comic book arc.
No, I love that. I actually need to finish the issues of that run that I never got to because I'm very bad keeping up
It's so good.
with
It's
comics.
just so good. It's so tense. It's
No, but thank you for the recommendation. For me, season of Doctor Who, if I'm taking it to a desert island, would be either season 13 of Tom Baker with, Pyramids of Mars and Brain of Morbius, or season 17 if we're including Shada. If we're
Mm.
not including Shada, then season 13 of Tom Baker. I don't know. Like, that's just my Doctor Who comfort food. I think, City of Death is probably, it's just so watchable and just so much fun.
Oh
I don't
yeah,
know.
sometimes I just pop that on for fun. It works as a movie.
Yes. No, it's so good. I love City of Death. Star Wars, I probably, I guess if I'm on a desert island, I'm gonna want comfort food, and I think I'd probably go with Return of the Jedi, even though it's far from my favorite Star Wars film.
And they escape from a desert right at the start, so
Yeah, that's true.
it's
Yeah.
very
So yeah,
aspirational. That's a good pick.
it's very comfortable for me. I have a soft spot in my heart for Return of the Jedi. Riley, do you have an answer to this impossible question that I
Yes, but before I give my answer, I will say that the planet I was talking about is called Shutoran, and the arc of the Star Wars comics is Volume 9, Hope Dies. It's very good. It's Hope
Oh,
Dies
very
and the
cool.
Escape and the Scourging of Shotoran, which is like a 3-part arc, and it's really good. And it's set up during Volume 7, The Ashes of Jeddah, but like it's a really good. It's just but Hope Dies especially is the one that I think is just mwah, chef's kiss. So I recommend
No,
that
it
one.
sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I'm definitely gonna
Um,
check that out.
I probably would have said Series 9 as well, but if I'm gonna like imagine that there's only one copy of them and Michael took them with him to his island and I had a different series,
Oh no!
I would probably
Oh god!
say Series 5, which is Moffat's
5.
first season at where and it's
Yeah.
funny because
Great year.
Matt Smith was never my favorite Doctor. For a while, I think he was my least favorite of the modern Doctors, but he's come around on me. But I think that as far as a season of Doctor Who that is almost consistently good every episode and has a lot of unique stuff happening in it and has a pretty solid arc over the course of the season. And you've also got some of the best episodes of his era all in one season. I think that would, and also my favorite Christmas special. So if I can bring that with me, which is Christmas Carol, if I can bring those together. The only episode that I think I would miss is that I think Doctor's Wife is in season 6, not season 5. But
Yes.
otherwise, I would be really excited to have had all of that. But I think that, yeah, because I think the 11th Hour is possibly the best new Doctor episode of the modern era. It's a great
Oh, for
episode
sure,
to
no doubt.
start people with if they're like, if you don't know when
Yeah.
if you're bringing a new viewer in. It's gotten a little bit wonky now because of the Chibnall era, but I used to always say, I had almost my own version of the machete cut to make it Star Wars appropriate.
Right.
I would say start with season 5, watch all the way through the end of season 7, and then before you watch Day of the Doctor, then you go back and watch Eccleston through Tennant, and then you come to Day of the Doctor once he gets the end of it.
Nice.
That's great.
And I think part of it, because a lot of people, like talking about the effects and the quality of the filmmaking earlier, a lot of people were turned off from 2005 when they first start watching because it's so janky compared to modern TV. But I think if you watch it after you've already fallen in love with Doctor Who, it has that charm you're
Exactly.
talking about and you get into it.
Right.
So that was my whole thing. So I think that would be it's funny because my favorite Capaldi is my Doctor. Like there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Capaldi is my Doctor. But I would say as far as just if you're talking about if you're taking season 9 off the table for me to choose from, then the next one I would go with season 5. I think those are Moffat's best 2 seasons by far as a writer for the show, as the showrunner.
No, I agree. Certainly as like a whole unit for sure.
Star Wars wise, if I had to pick a TV series, if I could pick a TV series, I would probably say Clone Wars because there's so much variety and stuff to choose from. But that feels like a cheat based on what the assignment was.
It's a lot of Star Wars.
If I had to take a movie, I think Last Jedi, I feel like, is the one that there's like enough interesting things happening that there will always be something new and fun to do. But honestly, I think I got to go with the first Star Wars. I think there's just something about, not unlike you said with Return of the Jedi, where it's just really fun. I think there's just something about that first story. First of all, the fact that it's so extremely self-contained. You don't.
Mhm.
I think the problem with bringing in Last Jedi or Empire Strikes Back or really almost any other Star Wars movie is there is that feeling of like, oh, but now I can't watch what came before or what came after. Like I can't watch the
Exactly.
setup or the finale. I with A New Hope, I can watch it from beginning to end, and that's it. That's the whole story, and you don't need anything else ever again. It's great. It's great as a Star Wars fan that we got it, but it's there. And so I think that would
Mm.
probably be mine.
No, those are two great answers. Yeah, I want us all to be on the same desert island so we can all have our picks. Well, I really want to thank both of you for participating in this discussion. It was a fever dream of mine to have both of you on for this topic, and I'm so glad that we were able to make it happen. And I feel like there's so much more that we could talk about, but
Riley
this
wouldn't stop talking about everything that came to her mind, so we lost a lot of what we've been to
no,
talk
no,
about.
I no,
No,
well,
that's
I
why you're here. What are you
no, that's
talking
why you're
about?
here. I love it. The whole reason to be here is to talk. I mean that's the name of the game. But I want to tee up the game of Rassilon so we can plug it. So Michael, I mean or Riley, what is the game of Rassilon and where can people find it?
The Game of Rassilon is a Doctor Who role-playing game podcast. We have 4 seasons now. We've just released our season finale. We have a Doctor Who Day special coming up in a little bit, and also a Christmas special. So keep an ear out for those. But yeah, we have 4 whole seasons of fun, spontaneous Doctor Who adventures. The first 3 years, it was myself and Ben Patton coming up with the scenarios, and Riley was our doctor, and we challenged her to a variety of universe risking thingies, whatever, Doctor Who stuff. And then the show has regenerated, much like the series does, and Riley has wonderfully stepped into the shoes as Game Missy. And we've been coming up with a whole new era of scenarios together that have been really, really fun. And we're already planning for Series 5, which is going to be 5 seasons. Yeah, I don't know. It'll be big. We'll find out.
Yeah, it's been an honor to do it. It was really fun switching up. It was an honor to play the Doctor. I loved doing it. Shockingly, my Doctor talked a lot. But um, it's been really cool.
Some of the best speeches in the book.
Ben asked me, because I had said it about the beginning of our third season. I had said like I think I'm about ready to hang up the coat and let somebody else be the Doctor. So our player Dan Peck, who was my companion during my era, is now our Doctor. And at one point, about a month or two later, Ben and Michael kind of like took me aside and said, we hate you, we hate everything you stand for, but we respect
The
you.
worst. Can't
And
stand. Oh my god.
and Ben had
Wait,
said
no,
like,
what?
because I had run a one-off for our Patreon subscribers that was based on Class very loosely. It's more based on Scooby Doo than Class, but they use Class as an excuse to make it. But Ben had said like, hey, you kind of had fun GMing, and it was an interesting take. Would you be wanting to take over as GM? And so I said yes. And so, but it's just a blast working on the show with Michael. I think Michael and I have had some really fun times clicking up different scenarios to throw at them and playing together. And I love the way Michael's brain works, and so I love collaborating with him.
No, yeah. I love what you guys put out. I said at the top, it's the best Doctor Who RPG show that's out there. And
It may be the only one. No, it's not.
no, it's not.
There are others.
But I mean, it is the only Doctor Who podcast that I listen to. I mean, for whatever that's worth. And where can we find both of you online, or do you have anything else that you guys want to plug?
I'll plug the books. I mean, I have written 3 Star Wars books that came out this year. So check those
Somewhat,
out.
somewhat,
Those,
somewhat
yeah.
relevant to the topic of the show. Yeah.
So I have Exploring Tatooine, which is an illustrated guide to the planet of Tatooine. I have Galaxy's Edge Treasures from Batu, which is like a fun little tchotchke book full of little trinkets and stuff that are Galaxy's Edge oriented. And then I have, if this is coming out in the near future, you have Time Still that came out this year. There's a pop-up advent calendar book it's technically don't have it in time for Life Day, but you can still get it for the actual Advent season. And it's basically it's a tree of life that pops out, and then there's a bunch of little like ornaments that are inside of it that you can hang from it every day. And so it's a Worcester tree, and then it has the ornaments that go around it. And there's a little like booklet in there that I wrote. It's a lot of summarizing a lot of other Life Day content, but the thing that I had the most fun doing was describing all the ornaments that go on the tree, which I got to do on my own. So that was fun.
Oh, that's very cool. I think I'm actually going to get that for my sister. I think she would love that.
Yeah, probably.
Is there a B. Arthur ornament?
I don't think there is, but if you want to, there is the ability, I think, to draw your own ornaments. So you could put her into it if you wanted to.
Oh, even.
All right.
Yeah.
All
They
right.
basically like, I think around 2020, 2021-ish, like 2020-ish, I think Disney realized like, hey, we have a built-in Christmas thing in our IP.
Exactly.
Let's
Yeah.
use it. And so
Yeah.
then in
Let's use it.
2021, a bunch of Life Day content came out. There were comic books. There's a Life Day Treasury book and stuff like that. And then also, if you go to Galaxy's Edge now, there's like dolls of Chewbacca holding a Life Day orb. And so they've done as
The
much to
robes and
bring
stuff they
back
have too?
Life Day as a thing without actually bringing back the Life Day special. Like it is very much like the special is
Yeah.
very much non-canonical, but the characters from it are canonical. And so like, I almost said Itchy and Scratchy, but yeah, like the
It,
Itchy and they're
Itchy
all
and Lumpy.
Itchy and
Yeah,
Lumpy are part of the story. And so they're
it's
there,
great. I
but
love
they're
it.
not yeah. So it's fun. It's really cute. And you can find me on the socials, mostly at Riley J. Silverman. On Instagram, I'm just Riley Silverman, but I'm on if Twitter still exists by the time you hear this, I'm on Twitter as Riley J. Silverman, and I'm on TikTok as Riley J. Silverman.
Well, Michael Nixon, Riley Silverman, thank you so much. This has been a delightful conversation. I could talk to the both of you for hours and hours and hours. So please, there's an open invitation. Both of you are welcome anytime. You have an itch to talk about anything Star Wars. If you like what you heard, please visit trashcompod.com where you can read transcripts of this episode and all of our other episodes. We are TrashCompod across all social media, and we will see you on the next one.